Hey guys, Chris here. Today we have a story about 4 young men who go to the Boundary Waters Canoe area wilderness of northern Minnesota, and there they have a series of really frightening events happen to them. Even one of them getting lost. That's next. All right, you guys, we are along the middle fork of the Feather River, Plumas National Forest, Northern California. It's a very large national forest, 1.1 million acres. And we just had a train go by just a moment ago. Today we have, for our beer, Good Life Brewing Company Descender IPA, and that is a 7% ABV on that one. And it says Descender IPA is a blend of Big True Northwest IPA mixed with some West Coast style. We balance the bitterness with the aromatics of the hops to make this a downright enjoyable IPA. It's pretty tasty already. Wow. Got some sand in there this time. And there we go. Pretty light looking. Almost amberish. Wow. That's got a kind of a hoppy, almost a hazy IPA. Just a little bit of a hazy kind of thing going on there. But yeah, really tasty. The Descender, I thought it was Ascender, it's Descender IPA. So apparently we're descending the mountain, not ascending the mountain, which is fine either way. So cheers. So our story takes place in May of 1986. 4 airmen from Grand Forks Air Force Base in North Dakota wanted to do a trip to the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness, BWCA. And Roy, John, Rick, and Ken were going to make this trip together. Now, the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness is over 1 million acres of lakes, forests, rivers, moose, loons, and great fishing. Classic Minnesota North Country. Now, it borders Canada right there at Ontario, and just north of the BWCA is Quetico Provincial Park, which is very similar, and it continues with over 2 million acres. So the whole area is 3 million acres of wilderness of lakes and forests. Just great country up there. So the first day, they canoed Crane Lake, Moose River, ended up on Agnes Lake. Set up camp, and that night they had 2 bears come into camp, give them a really hard time with their food, with their camp, and they had a hard time sleeping, and they decided the next morning to get out of there. So they paddled across Agnes Lake, found the 1-mile portage to Ram's Head Lake, did the big portage across, carried all their gear, canoes, everything across this portage, got to Ram's Head Lake, and they were in the middle of Ram's Head Lake, and there was a series of islands in Ram's Head Lake. A small one, a medium size, and then a good size, larger island, or in kind of the northwest part of this lake. That this would be a great place to camp, fish, and just spend a couple days here. They set up camp, and then the next day, they were all really tired except John. Just bushed from the travel and the portaging and all the work that it takes to move all your gear through a wilderness area by a canoe. And so John said, you know, I want to go see this waterfall kind of across the lake here on this inlet, this stream called Meander Creek. So they said, fine, we're going to rest and hang out. And so John got in his canoe, solo paddled about 20 minutes from the island to this inlet, paddled up the stream, and parked the canoe off to the side, and he heard there was a cascade, a small waterfalls upstream, and so he hiked upstream looking for this waterfalls. He got there, it was a little bit smaller than he thought it was going to be, a little kind of disappointed. He was just kind of relaxing, thinking about, maybe doing some fishing that afternoon, and just really nice being out there. And all of a sudden he hears, in this thick brush behind him, some footfalls. Something kind of walking around. And it almost sounded like it was circling him. He was kind of in this area, this little bowl-like, with the creek behind him, and this footfalls were moving around, circling him. And he wasn't too concerned. He was thinking maybe this is a moose, maybe it's a deer, I'm not sure. He's listening, it's breaking branches. It sounded pretty large. And then all of a sudden there's this loud crack, like a piece of wood hitting a tree. This tree knock sound startled him, kind of got his attention, and he's like, okay, this is not a moose, this is not a bear. And he's listening, and then you can hear footfalls going, and then off to the left, 60 yards away, he hears it again. This loud crack sound, almost like a gunshot. It was so loud. And at that moment, he got up, started running down the path towards his canoe, shoves off, hops in, and he paddles the 20 minutes back to the island. And as he's paddling, two of his friends, Rick and Ken, see him paddling pretty furiously across like this channel to the island. And so as soon as he pulls up, they come down, they go, what's going on? What's wrong? He goes, he didn't know how to articulate what was going on. And he started kind of telling them what was happening. And then Roy comes down, and he was like higher ranking in the Air Force than the other three. And he said, what's going on? Please explain yourself. And he tried to articulate. There was this loud sound, and it scared me. It sounded like somebody maybe in the forest. I don't know. Didn't see any canoes over there. I couldn't imagine. And then Roy, the higher ranking guy of the group from the Air Force, said, let's go and show this pussy up. And he rousted the rest of them to get in their canoes and to go over there and to confront this potential person messing with them in the forest. Now John reluctantly got in the canoe. He wasn't really sure he wanted to go back, but since they were all going, he thought, okay, that's fine. I'll go figure out what's going on over there. They do the 20 minutes over there, land the canoes, go upstream, don't hear anything, just hear the stream going, just kind of like this. You can just hear the river flowing. And John starts explaining to the other two a little more in detail what happened, and they started making fun of him and kind of joking with him, like, oh, the old Boy Scout, a little scared of the woods now, because apparently John had some experience in the Boy Scouts. And right then, crack, this loud wood to tree knocking sound happened, and they all were dead quiet. And they're listening, and they can hear the footfalls moving around, and then crack another time, and they're looking, they're trying to catch up with what's happening, and then across the creek, and they didn't hear any movement go across the creek, they heard another one, another loud crack sound on a tree. And they're listening, kind of waiting, and then they hear one about 20 yards into this thick brush, just 20 yards away. Boom, crack. And Roy says, all right, that's it. He had a canoe paddle with him that he carried from the canoe, and he charges headlong into the brush. Didn't say to the other guys what he was doing. He was obviously going to confront this noisemaker about what he was doing. He goes in there, and they can hear him moving through the forest, and then they could hear crack, this sound again, and then again, and every time they heard it 4 times, it would get farther and farther away. And then after 10 minutes, they heard Roy yell out, "Hey, you guys! Hey, you guys! Help! I'm lost. I got turned around in here." And so they were outside of this thick brush, all three of them, and then they started calling out to Roy, telling him, "Over here, well, keep going, this way, follow our voices," and they were trying to guide him back to where they were to get him out of the brush. Takes 4 or 5 minutes. He finally comes out of the brush. He's scraped up. There's a little bit of blood on his arm. And he says, "Go to the canoes now, immediately." And they just, okay. And they all rushed down the path, got in their canoes, paddled back to the island. Once back at the island, we're back up at camp, and he explained to them that he heard this sound. Obviously, they all heard the sound, and he was following it, and every time he got near it, he would hear it again, but it was somewhere else. And he could never catch the sound. It would follow the creek, and it would hear it crack, and then he would catch up to where he thought the sound was, and there was nothing there. And then his haste to catch this person, he would continue on deeper and deeper, and then he hit a certain point where he went, "I'm being led into a trap. This thing is trying to lead me away from my friends and get me lost, and who knows what else it wants to do." And it was intentionally trying to trick him to go farther away and get him lost. He was really unnerved by this whole thing. He thought he was going to catch up to a person and just, have this confrontation and tell them that's not cool to be hiding in the woods, messing with people. He could never catch up with the sound. And they were like, "Wow, this is pretty crazy." And they all realized it's too late in the day to leave this lake and go somewhere else. And they were pretty far into the wilderness area. So they collected a bunch of firewood, made a really good sized fire, and they had a large 4-man tent. They all stayed in one tent. And the tent was already up from the previous night. And they made some dinner, and they were just kind of listening and waiting and just talking about what the heck happened. And John starts talking. He says, "I remember a few years ago, I was doing some volunteer work at the Lac La Croix Native American Indian Reservation just north of Quetico in Canada, there in Ontario. And they would have stories about Wendigo, the creature of the north. And he heard several stories about Wendigo, and he didn't know what to make of them. And now, after what happened, he started to bring it up as like, okay, this is interesting. He also remembered them talking about canoes missing. The Native Americans at the reservation that he was volunteering at would have stories about these canoes going missing, and they would blame the Americans on the other side of the border for coming up and stealing canoes and taking them. And then they also had kind of a general story of the same thing, that they were being blamed for coming down and stealing canoes and bringing them north. And when John was hearing this, they kind of laughed and said, "There's no way, though, that you could steal canoes in the middle of the night and make these portages in the darkness and not be caught. And with all the rocks and how rough the terrain is, it's very dangerous, it's very treacherous. You just can't do that." And so either side, Canada and the United States, were kind of blaming each other for these missing canoes. And John remembered these people talking about, he talked to the rangers as well in the Superior National Forest, which is adjacent to the BWCA. And they had their story from the opposite side. And then he heard this story from this outfitter that had brought these Boy Scouts into Boot Lake. And one night while they're out there, they heard these growls and grunts and something moving around the camp and even some tree knocks, and it absolutely frightened the children, the Boy Scouts, as well as the outfitter. He'd never experienced anything like this before in his life, and nor did he ever want to experience anything like this. And the next day they came down, and of the 4 canoes they had, one of them was missing and they couldn't find it, and so they kind of had to double up and get the kids out of there, and they got out of there the best they could. But he remembered that story. So it's getting late, and these 4 guys are still standing around the campfire, still pretty unnerved. They decide to go to bed, get some rest. They don't think they're going to sleep much that night, and they're laying in their sleeping bags. 2 of them are sleeping, 2 of them are half awake, and they both hear, the 2 that are awake, this loud splashing down by where the canoes are at the base of the island. It's a good sized island, but it's fairly steep, and they're kind of up a ways, and then down in this little, almost like a bay on the island, this loud splash. And it was about 4:30 a.m. and the sun was going to come up pretty soon, so they woke up the other 2 guys and said, we heard some loud splashing and some movement in the water down by the canoes. And so they all got up, got the flashlights, worked their way down, and they went down to the canoes. They still had 2 canoes down there. But while they're down there, Roy saw on the rocks a footprint, a wet footprint, about 14 inches long, half as wide, on one of the rocks, still kind of wet. And then they saw some tracks, pretty hard to discern, but long tracks, almost like toes in them, in the sand, in the rocks. Really unnerved by this, because whatever this was must have swam over from the shore and pulled itself out onto this small beach. And maybe it was still on the island now. They had no idea where this thing was. And so they quickly packed everything up, brought it down, loaded it up, got their gear, made sure everything was ready to go, and they shoved off. As they're paddling away, they're parallel to this island, pretty big island. And the island's pretty steep, and they're almost like next to the forest, and just feeling unnerved, looking into the forest, just wondering if the creature is still on the island somewhere, maybe watching them. Just waiting for them to break out into the main body of the lake. They got out in the main body of the lake, they portaged over into Lamb Lake, and then there was a swamp between Lamb Lake and Nina Moose Lake, and they had to endure that and go through this swamp, like pulling the canoes, and just kind of a mess. And they got to Nina Moose Lake, they're just exhausted, set up camp, and they were close to getting out of there. But that night they heard something else moving around the forest for about 15 minutes that night. Just something in the forest. Nothing else, no tree knocks, no nothing, but just enough to keep them unnerved about the whole situation. The next morning, got everything together, and they made their way out of the BWCA, loaded up, and went home. Roy said he still likes to canoe in northern Minnesota, stays in contact with a couple of the guys, lost contact with Roy, but that was his story, and he always remembers what happened in northern Minnesota in 1986. And that is our story for today about Mr. Sasquatch. He appears to be all over the place. There's a lot of stories I get. I get stories from you guys, I get comments. There's all kinds of things I hear about, and it's pretty incredible. So, wow. So thank you guys for listening and for watching my channel. We're gonna keep going here, and I appreciate you guys. We'll see you next time. As always, keep hiking.